I want to talk about sex bots. But I can't. Well, I mean, I can, but I can't talk about sex bots and still get paid. If you can believe that, even though I write about this sort of thing all the time, not the sex bots in particular, but about inventions, devices, policies that have social or economic impacts. And Bill, you're losing it already. And the thing is, what I found out is I have to use euphemisms. So I'm going to talk about knitting bots. That's right, the most innocuous thing you could possibly imagine, except that apparently people are doing some pretty filthy things with their knitting bots. But that's not even the angle I want to talk about. I came across this very interesting article in The Spectator, the USA edition of The Spectator, talking about the rise of artificial intelligence and knitting bots, and what this might mean, both good and bad. And so I wrote a column on this for PJ Media on Tuesday, and absolutely nothing prurient in this column about knitting bots whatsoever. We're talking about things like if you've got a brothel full of knitting bots, you don't have to import sex slaves from the Philippines or Eastern Europe. And that would be a benefit. I think we can all agree on that, to eliminate or reduce human trafficking. On the other hand, we're in a social situation in this country where the younger generation, the millennials, they aren't dating as much, they aren't having as much sex, and the fertility rate is in a shocking 7-year decline, and the presence of knitting bots is going to exacerbate that existing trend. And these are very important issues that I think need a serious discussion. But what I found out from my managing editor, Paula Bolyard, is Google, who manages so much of the ad revenue that websites depend on, will flag that as porn. And the revenue dries up. My paycheck dries up, and suddenly I find out that through no fault of my own, there are things we aren't allowed to talk about. What do you call that, Scott?
That's the Google world we live in, where our fortunes are determined by a corporation. It's interesting because when I post the videos to YouTube for Bill Whittle Now and for Right Angle, I write these tags. There's this box where you can use up to 500 characters worth of tags. If you use a word like, let's say, knit, and you put that in, if you put that in the tag thing, it gets flagged as potentially controversial. But I found out the other day, like just the initials ISIS also make it suspect. The word gun makes it suspect. And even things like the word hate could be trouble. And it's flagged by this service.
So let me interrupt here for just a sec to explain to people what these tags mean. When you tag this metadata on the video, people don't actually see those tags necessarily, but it aids in them finding videos that they're interested in. So if they want to see something, if they want to see news about ISIS, that ISIS tag is buried in there, and that video will show up in their search results. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And the reality is that since the beginning of time, men have been fascinated with knitting. And I would suspect
women
that
too.
That even the very first fashioning of a hand tool of some point, probably done by a woman who was trying to solve a problem, and then the man saw it and thought, I wonder if I could knit with that. I just think that there is something deep in the human physiognomy, pardon the expression, that would that inspires people to take any new technology and either apply it to war or knitting. They both seem like these internal drives and compulsions that must be satisfied. It's kind of sad, but I could see, you're right, your acknowledgement of saying, well, we won't have to bring over boatloads of illegal immigrants to perform as knitting slaves, so that's better. My guess is it's kind of like saying, well, let's eliminate this particular tax, without increasing the other. No, they're going to increase the other. So I don't think there's any way that by bringing a substitute to market, you necessarily stop the use of the original product. But I don't think that Google should be in a position to decide that. I think the market, in essence, should. Now, I do kind of wish that there was something the way there used to be. I mean, a kid could not just stroll into a store and say, hey, give me that magazine that's wrapped in paper or plastic, because it was behind the counter. And you had to ask, old Mr. Smithers at the counter if he would hand you a copy of that magazine, and he'd say, how old are you? And you'd say 11, and he'd say no.
No, that's right.
And so, and I kind of
How did you know me when I was 11?
That I kind of miss the fact that there's no counter anymore, and no more Mr. Smithers who would keep you from getting that which is not salutary for your mental health. But do I want to tell Google what to do with their private business? Yes. Yes, I do want to tell them that. Do I want to tell the government to have Google do something with their private business? No. So I wish, here's the problem. Everything online is so stinking private that people will do the worst possible things because they think no one's watching. And, it's that myth where people think that they're good enough to earn God's favor. And, if you ask them, hey, what if you were being monitored at all times, audio and video? Would you feel comfortable scrolling that video in front of the Almighty? And I think most people go, never mind.
Yeah. Bill, here's where it gets really interesting. So I write this column, I publish it, it'll get tens of thousands of views, hundreds of comments. Last I saw is up to a couple hundred already. The problem is we had to remove the ads from it. Otherwise, Google would tag our entire website, all the PJ Media, not just my column, as porn, and our revenues dry up and put us out of business. But you can bet that the New York Times can publish as many stories or op-eds on the use of knitting bots as they like and not have Google remove a single dime of their ad revenue. What do you call that?
Well, I call that censorship, and I call that fraud. As it turns out, we have a firewall up right now. Last one I did was 3 good reasons to break up these social media giants like Google and so on. One of them was, if you use the term, I'm going to Google something, it usually means I'm going to go on the internet to find out what's true. If it turns out that some snot-nosed guy up in Mountain View, California is determining what you see without you knowing that he's determining what you see, then I think that's fraudulent business practice. A much better argument in terms of the law is that the internet is broken up essentially into 2 different kinds of providers. There are publishers like us here. We're publishing our opinion and we're responsible for what we say, and we can be sued and copyright infringements and all the rest. But Google, Facebook, and YouTube call themselves carriers, which gives them a great deal of protection, because that means that if somebody posts, let's say, a picture of Mickey Mouse, which is copyrighted, on their Facebook page, you can't go after Facebook in order to, you can't sue Facebook for that. Disney can't sue Facebook for that, because the carrier law means basically, hey man, we're just hosting it. We're just putting it up there. But when they start editing, and when they start telling you that you can be demonetized because they think that there's something that they don't like you saying, either in terms of the knitting or in terms of the politics, now they're editorializing, and that makes them a publisher. And if they're a publisher, they're not a carrier. And if they're not a carrier, they're sued out of business in 10 minutes. So there are lots of good reasons to break this up, and the monopoly one is another one on top of that. So that's the thing. And I think actually the knitting issue actually does need to say something that's, I think, kind of relevant. When I really try and get far, far back and look down, from geostationary orbit, what it looks like to me in the late teens and maybe early 2020s is the world looks like it is beginning to reach the point where progressivism is by nature, with its constant victimhood and constant finding of injustice, progressivism now has come to the point where it is feeding on itself, and it is no longer sustainable in terms of the real world. One great example is the idea that if a guy who feels like a woman gets to run a race in the women's categories, and we don't want to hurt his feelings because he feels like a woman, then that means we have to hurt the feelings of 30 million other female athletes who all of them take one step down on the podium because we don't want to hurt this person's feelings. This is when I talk about reality colliding with progressivism. And as far as the knitting goes, the knitting machine that you're talking about is essentially a knitting machine that performs as well or better than their human counterparts.
Yeah, over the next few years, AI is really going to...
There's no question. It's coming. And what's interesting about this, Scott is right, it's going to be very, very bad for society, but this is, I think, the only way we're going to get out of this. We need to pass progressivism so that we can find out what's in it. And so here's what's going to happen, Steve. These knitting bots are going to become exceedingly popular. And the reason they're going to become exceedingly popular is because progressivism and feminism have destroyed any incentive whatsoever for males to make the decision between being promiscuous and being in a committed relationship. It is a sacrifice for men to do this. Marriage is a deal for women in terms of the biology. What's the word I'm looking for?
Monogamy?
Monogamous, yes. Monogamous relationships are an invention of the West that are a deal made for women. Historically, the more powerful you were, the more women and concubines you had, and you grew more children, and they were your labor force, and they were your tax base, and all the rest of it. But monogamy is a deal made for women because it's against the male biological imperative. So if it turns out that men are going to make this deal, they ought to get something for it. And what the left has done is made sure that men not only don't get any reward for being married, but get absolutely demonized and punished and told they're defective girls and potential rapists and stuff. So the men are just going to check out. And when they can find something that knits better than the girl next door can knit, then a lot of women are going to find themselves very, very, very alone. And they're going to realize that the men are going to be taking knitting lessons, and then they're going to be playing computer games. Then they're going to be going down to the bar and hanging out with their buddies, and they're going to be doing all the things that they want to do because they have set up a world where there's no reason whatsoever for them to sacrifice those things in order to be married. So I think the knitting bots are going to lead to a population disaster that will then lead to some semblance of normalcy when half of the population discovers that the deal that they had, and I'm not talking about you don't get to be a doctor, I'm just talking about the relationship between men and women, the traditional marriage. When they find out that there is now an alternative for men, they're not going to be happy about it.
Yeah, well, there'll be an
awful lot of fish without bicycles out there, and they are they're going to be dreaming of the old days when they could go out with a nice swim.
Yeah, the article I read in The Spectator actually started off with the other angle, and that these knitting bots are going to be tailored for women every bit as much as they're going to be tailored for men.
Women have had knitting bots for quite a while.
Yeah, well, the AI-enhanced ones that are going to be coming out over the next 5 to 10 years are going to put those things to shame. And it's just, it reminds me of something. You know, you'll be able someday to tailor-make this knitting bot to fulfill everything you ever wanted. But what it can never do is surprise you the way a human being can by being everything you never knew you wanted. And that human element is what's going to be missing, because I don't care how smart, how artificially smart a robot is, it still only knows what you told it to be. A human being has the power to shock and surprise and delight you in ways that something you program never ever could. That aside, I want to talk about the really insidious thing going on here with our ad networks and our social networks. Pro-life organizations, or maybe it's just one big one I can't remember, is now banned from Pinterest, having been flagged as porn. And the reason is that Pinterest doesn't want pro-life messages on Pinterest. And hey, you know what? It's their platform. They can do whatever they like with it. But they're tagging this stuff as porn. It isn't. This is what happened to me yesterday. I wrote an article for which the company I work for will not get paid, because otherwise Google will flag our entire site as spam and our revenues will dry up. This is a really insidious form of defamation is what it is. Because normally to defame somebody, you have to go public with some horrible and untrue accusation about them. What's happening here is that people like me, entire organizations, are being defamed silently. Nobody's going, oh, you can't read Vodka Pundit, that's a porn site. No, nothing like that. What's happening is the algorithms are going, oh, he said knitting bots, it's about porn, we're not going to let them advertise on there anymore. And nobody finds out, except for on shows like this. Nobody finds out because this all happens invisibly, it happens silently, it happens behind the scenes on servers, and the result is that entire viewpoints are being shut out of the public debate, and this is a much poorer country for that. I'm Steve Green. This is Right Angle with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.